Hello, everybody. Welcome to G4D's coverage of Marvel Avengers Alliance 1 here on YouTube. Today's video is the top 5 most impactful bruisers in PvP's history. Now, unlike the generalist video, this one is incredibly more complex and is actually going to be the top 11, but I'm going to consider it a main 5 with some honorable mentions. For the generalist video, a viewer did catch that Angel was missed in that one, and that is definitely a bad miss. Angel was a very popular generalist when he came out, as he was very obnoxious with his size and the amount of healing that he did with his team and keeping them alive. So that was an unfortunate miss on my part. So I did miss that one. Today's background soundtrack is brought to you by the Dead Space 3 OST. The Dead Space series has always been a favorite of mine. Had some big fears in between 2 and 3 that 3 was going to be a little too actiony and not horror enough, but those fears were definitely put to rest. Hopefully we get a Dead Space game on the current gen consoles at some point. So, let's go ahead and jump into it. We're going to deal with 2 of the honorable mentions first before we get into the first one on the countdown. So, first honorable mention, we definitely have to give over to the default Captain America and the World War II Captain America. In reality, it is definitely the Bruiser version of the World War II Captain America that is extremely popular with beginner PvPers. This is one of the suits that everybody typically goes for, and this is probably somebody's first tank when it comes to PvP. And he shows up. We've kind of forgotten about him now, and a lot of new players have access to way more heroes than us old bees did when it came to picking heroes. But yeah, World War II Captain America is quite the nuisance at early PvP and lower levels of it. Way back in the day. He's not what he used to be, but he was quite obnoxious back then, even before he started getting personal ISOs and everything. So, aside from Captain, his fellow Avengers compatriot is definitely deserving of an honorable mention, and that is Thor. Thor, in his default suit, was definitely quite popular back in the day, mostly because of the fact that with certain people like Emma and Iron Patriot, he was known as a sweeper. He just charged up and did huge amounts of damage. Modern Armor Thor came along and started him off with 2 stacks of Might of Mew Mew, or Mjolnir, which meant he was super accelerated. We didn't really have to worry about ISOs that much back then, so having the only 1 ISO slot really wasn't too big of a dip. Quite popular. He's changed a little bit in modern era with the Age of Ultron Thor and Mighty Thor coming in. Mighty Thor definitely weighs in both for the Bruiser and the Scrapper version, especially now with 15, where you can activate a nice double hit. But the original 2 Bruiser uniforms were pretty popular for sweeper teams back in the day. So, let's jump into the first most impactful Bruiser on the countdown, and that is going to be Juggernaut. Now, our boy Jugs has faded out really mightily recently, and that is because of the Hugin's Eye and the draining and everything like that. Melee, non-stealthy melee was just kind of written out. It was really tough to pull off Juggernaut now. However, don't underestimate this dude. He's still pretty good. And he even now has some ISOs like I'm the Juggernaut gains a chance to keep momentum when being used. Still looks a little weird, still kind of looks like a bullet from Dungeons and Dragons there with that helmet. And, you know, this one's shaped a little bit better than this, but Juggernaut and Quicksilver teamed up quite effectively back in the day, especially with the Dragon's Foot, otherwise known as the Steps of Shu Lao. Juggernaut can still be pulled off pretty well, except for the fact that you're going to have to worry about him maybe getting protected against and drain. But he worked out well with people like Quicksilver and even Moonstone, who buffs up melee. The Dragon's Foot was definitely something that was used quite frequently with our boy Jugs over here. As a matter of fact, the momentum generator, which is also very good for melee, is named off of Juggernaut. And of course, we now have the free action version of it. Maybe he'll rise to power again someday. Maybe people will ISO him correctly and use some new E-ISOs to turn him into a beast. But we really don't know where Juggernaut's power is now, but he certainly was quite popular back in the day. Moving on to a different style of bruiser, somebody a little bit more protecty than Jugs, we come to Groot. Groot is one of those bruisers who definitely enjoyed a large time in the limelight, be it his default suit or his movie suit. Groot was quite obnoxious as a tank for a team. When the movie suit came out, then you had tons of buffs being added to it, where the Guardians of the Galaxy were immune to fatal blows, and they take 50% less damage when their health is below 35. And then, of course, you have the badge giving everybody the survival training and whatnot. He absolutely made Guardians of the Galaxy teams very, very obnoxious to deal with. And since you couldn't fatal blow him, you were almost guaranteed to deal with a res. Now, the non-movie suit takes away some of these, but it actually adds to ISO slots. So, Modern Groot could potentially still be used, but nobody really is. He showed up quite often with Gamora. A little bit Infiltrator, Star-Lord, not too much Drax, but Gamora was definitely one of his most common teammates back then. He was susceptible to Exhausted, as that would mean he would often just do I am Groot and then do nothing else in the first turn. He's faded out quite successfully. Whether or not he can still be turned around today with some of the more protecting ISOs that were given to us a little while ago, we don't really know. But Groot definitely was around quite popularly for some time. Now let's moving on to an honorable mention, and that is Ares. Ares, unlike Groot, never just enjoyed a burst and then faded. Ares has kind of always been there. He was definitely more popular back in the day, but you know, he's still fairly solid. The rise of the Mystic and now the Lantern of Doom kind of shut down Ares a little bit, except for the fact that Crush Your Enemies actually removes that buff. So if you are a PvPer and you are experiencing too many issues running against the Lantern of Doom because it was just recently sold, or the Mystic and everything, you can go to Ares. The problem is the Deb is making slight bit of a comeback thanks to the fact that Cloak and Dagger have several moves that are stealthy, if you go that way, but aren't subtle. Which means the Deb now actually has a few important things to work against. That means Ares would have some issues because of his ranged and gun attacks. If you can get him to work, he does have an ISO that gives him 3 stacks of bleeds on his Art of War, which is near impossible to get going other than Fandral. Now, Fandral does it AoE, but Ares does considerably more damage single target, and he brings a remove buffs to the table. His Modern Warfare also gives Despair, and it gives Despair as a default. So you don't have to try to ISO it or shoehorn in some blasters doing it or whatnot. Ares has always been pretty popular, and there's actually nothing too much stopping him from being popular now, other than deb usage and potentially tanking the art of war. However, it isn't unarmed, so the Hugen's wouldn't have been an issue. But tanks will definitely tank this. But, you know, tanking 3 stacks of bleeds with a tenderized and a ravaged on top of it is pretty tough. Especially when you have despair going and a hemorrhaging attack. Moving on, let us get back to the actual members of the countdown. So we've dealt with Jugs and Groot. Who else are we going to deal with? And that is our boy Iron Fist. Now, you could say Iron Fist showed up in a scrapper version, but in all honesty, his Bruiser version was a little bit more popular than the scrapper version. Now, back in the day, of course, he had his default suit, which was a scrapper. But then when he got his chapter mastery, we got this lovely new white suit called the Heroic Age Iron Fist. Right out of the gate, his combo breaker was a complete nightmare. It is the single biggest reason why the Neuro Purge became extremely popular. You absolutely had to shut down that combo breaker. Otherwise, any like follow-up or counterattacks were just going to be an issue. He also had a severely powerful wind-up from the heart into the Iron Fist, or White Hot Iron Fist at the time. It was pretty much a one-shot, and this was taking people out of PvP left and right. Eventually, though, that combination got slightly nerfed, and Iron Fist dipped on the offense, but was still the best supporter of all time. He was a little stupid on defense, as it was kind of easy to bait out his heals, and if a Despair was out there, well, then he wasn't going anywhere. So you can place Despair on somebody, get him low, and bait out the Praying Lotus. Or just simply the Healing Chi. It was pretty rare to see Heroic Gauge Iron Fist do a 9-6, although you could definitely create a scenario in which he would attempt to do a 9-6. That would be when somebody is low at the end of the first round, before he goes. If somebody's very low, Iron Fist will definitely do a 9-6. But, I gotta tell you, if you ran afoul of so many 9-6s in PvP, you were doing something way wrong, and I just blame your combat style for that one. It's nobody's fault but your own if you started seeing a lot of 9-6s. For a while, we began to think that his nerfs were all about people crying, that he was too strong, too powerful, too annoying, and just made everything easy mode. Now, as we see people like Angrier and Blue Marvel and Cloak and Dagger, we maybe begin to figure out that Iron Fist was nerfed slightly to pave the way for other heroes doing some similar things. Now, for example, the Healing Chi, the fact that it gives rising up to the team when done as a 9-6, could be part of Blue Marvel's kit now. Blue Marvel essentially does the same thing as a quick action. Granted, Blue Marvel has to do it a little bit later in the fight compared to Hafe, but the fact is, he can do it. Still, we all lament the time in which Hafe was a god, and his 9-6 not only would remove everything, but it would prevent things from happening unless the Scroll of Runamaroth was out, or Pesty. He was also extremely popular on group bosses. Iron Fist and Molly Hayes was definitely a very popular group boss killer of mine. Unfortunately, Iron Fist has now been nerfed into the point where he's just lowly. It's really, really sad. We all look at him and just weep for what Hafe used to be. Going back to the honorable mentions, I just actually mentioned her briefly, and she definitely deserves a strong honorable mention, if not actually her own spot on the countdown. But her time in the spotlight was a little bit less popular than some of the other ones who are on the countdown, and that is, of course, Molly Hayes, Princess Power. Molly Hayes was extremely popular once people started getting her around level 14, which was the cap at the time. She was so popular that people whipped out Invisible Woman, slapped air pressure on her, and you had one temper tantrum throwing teenager in your face, probably wiping your team. The reason why Molly was so strong is behind air pressure, she could not be turned off. The biggest thing that turns Molly off is, of course, exhausted. Back in the day, her AI was quite stupid, and if you exhausted her, she'd still tantrum anyway, and she would wind up burning herself out after the end of the first move. Molly was extremely popular, especially when you started factoring in personal ISOs like Sweet, or the caffeinated one. As it turns out, if you used Heroic Age Iron Fist and you prevented debuffs, Molly didn't fall asleep after her tantrum. Whether or not that's a bug or an exploit, that's for a different video, but it seems as if falling asleep was considered a debuff and Hafe actually removed it. This could be abused for group bosses, and it was also highly abusable in PvP, especially for offense. I ran her for defense quite some time with Null using the tag team ISO, so that every time Molly did a melee ability, especially if she raspberried and then countered with melee, Null had a chance at an extra turn. Sadly, the anti-melee meta kind of ran her down, and then of course, the stamina nerf really ran her down. Molly took a huge hit when stamina was normalized to basically be PvE levels. She's still okay against group bosses, but really only if you can set up a flank so she gets 2 moves for the price of 1. Still, Molly Hayes goes down as just one of the biggest offensive threats on offense and defense of all time. She pretty much created the rise of Shieldbreaker. You could say Invisible Woman created the rise of Shieldbreaker, but in all honesty, Invisible Woman just protects the larger threat, which mostly was Molly Hayes at the time. I like me some Molly Hayes. I really did miss using her. Speaking of Null, let's talk about more Bruisers on the countdown. We'll round it up, and then we'll finish off the honorable mentions. And that is Null and Kurth, stacked right on top of each other. The two worthy. My god, these two have held power positions for a long time. And for one of them, it's never really dipped. Now, Null disappeared from the meta for a little while when magic warding became extremely strong. It became extremely strong because his meteor stacks got classified as magic. So if you ran magic warding, you really didn't have to worry about meteor stacks. So that essentially wrote Null right off the planet in terms of his popularity, and he almost all but disappeared. Well, he grabbed a hold of his worthy coattails and hung on for dear life, just getting dragged around by other worthies' ankles, and now has made a huge comeback thanks to the magic warding rework. You could say it's a nerf, you could say it's a rework. It's up for debate, but the change to magic warding, as it were, really brought Null screaming back to the forefront. Then the debuff ISOs came out, and that also brought him back to the forefront. Him and Angrier, him and Kurth, him and Quicksilver, him and Cloak and Dagger, him and just about anybody are now extremely popular. And that is because You Are Not Worthy has a big chance of putting out any debuff that is attached to it. Now, thanks to the Lunacy, or the Force of Lifeblade, and the Deb, it still could be a little bit of an issue. If you erase subtle mechanics, the Deb will stop. Something like You're Not Worthy. However, it's a little rare to see that combination now. What isn't exactly that rare is the anti-buff/debuff item from the Spec Ops. That one doesn't care about stealth or subtle. It actually has no drawback to it. So that item can and will stop You're Not Worthy from going off. Sometimes it does seem like the additional effects of You're Not Worthy work, like the Despair, but it's kind of inconsistent. Null is definitely back to a power position in the meta. And even though Angrier is a little bit more stupid this season, Null isn't. Still susceptible to exhausted though, as he will use his class benefit, and then you're not worthy, and then that's the end of him. So you can definitely stave off the meteor stacks if you need to. And thankfully the meteor stacks do go away if you kill Null. Kurth, unlike Null, never took a dip in popularity. She's always remained super strong. It also seems like we still have a bug going on with Kurth. She is still capable of double draining if she is running Scudam. That is something that has been reported to Playdom for a long time, and has never really gone away. They did fix draining in Grit, but they've never come back and fixed draining in Kurth. Now, the community at large believes it is because she is unstunnable. There is something about being unstunnable and draining that causes a double drain. It's really quite ridiculous if you have your Null set up to protect, and she goes to do a Stonebreaker, and Null does his little pre-counter, and Kurth winds up double draining. Even if you put Despair on Kurth, you still have to worry about the fact that the drain goes off, and stamina is now a definite commodity in PvP. Kurth has always been super strong, but this season, it seems like the AI does not always open up with Fear Me. Some people are saying that it's the Scrapper version that does not necessarily do Fear Me as the opening salvo, but I need to pay more attention to it. I do definitely know that Fear Me as the first Kurth action is not always a guarantee. She's always had really strong ISOs like Revengeance, which guarantees she'll counter if something is thrown her way. And there's also a few others that she has, like the Total Control for the Love Me, and there's another one. But she's also definitely a big user of Scudam. Road to Ruin is classified as magic, so she does go somewhat well with Null. And of course, Fear Me just creates that very annoying cower situation. Stonebreaker can be outfitted to exploit stuns and deliriums, which means she definitely goes with quite a good amount of people. Being a flyer, you need Eruption to hit her, and she has a great thing of being immune to psychic and delirium effects, which has enabled her to walk through Blackest Voids, the stuff from Cloak and Dagger, etc. So that rounds out our actual members of the countdown. They are Too Worthy and Null and Kurth, Juggernaut, Groot, and Heroic Age Iron Fist. So for the final honorable mentions, we've dealt with Ares, we've dealt with Molly, Thor, the beginner tank of Captain America. Let's go ahead and talk about the best buffer of all time, our dude Hindle. So Hindle was somewhat popular when he first came about. He was often used with other rising up heroes, Omega Sentinel definitely being one of them. He definitely boasts one of the hugest hitting single target attacks in the game. Havoc was slightly nerfed due to his, but Heimdall definitely has a round 2 put away. Vigilance Yallarhorn into a Ho Fund results in a lot of dead people. Of course, nowadays we have to deal with the fact that they are both melee, but he's still really solid. They finally fixed a bunch of his passives, like the chance to negate preemptive counterattacks, but now he has his beautiful E-ISO that says he has a chance to preemptively negate counterattacks, which is kind of the same thing as what Farsight's supposed to do. But the biggest thing that he brings to the table is pretty much enemy attacks can't be stealthy. This is really great if you know what you're doing, because you can often set up... Excuse me, it's a little early in the morning here. You can set up some really decent traps. A lot of people, when they see Heimdall, they kind of forget that he has that no stealth policy. He's kind of like a manager that doesn't want you coming in late. You can't get in the back door with this dude. So if you have somebody on the team that is protecting, like the agent You can definitely protect a hot commodity when Heimdall is on the field, and this works for just about anybody. You don't always have to think of Heimdall as a rising up hero. You can think of him as just somebody who stops stealth. So what better way to protect, say, a fragile enchantress or cloak and dagger than have him negate stealth and have the agent equipped with a bunch of tanky gear like the Blade of the Guardian or the Deb or things like that. Blade of the Guardian is, of course, a huge friend of Heimdall because the Blade of the Guardian likes rising up buffs and then starts healing you when you get them all. He is extremely obnoxious when he is helping protect a real hot topic on the team. For example, a few seasons ago, I faced him and Angrier, and normally I like to get to Angrier first, but unfortunately, thanks to Heimdall turning off stealth, which is what my team was at the time, the agent protected both Heimdall and Angrier, so the agent went first. And then with no protection, I was able to take down Angrier. He could definitely go with some worthy in the fact that he's melee based, so he would work out quite well with Null. He works out well with Nurkod. He works out well with Blue Marvel. He works out with anybody who likes rising up buffs, as he's the only one who guarantees them until Blue Marvel came along. Very, very strong character. You can't underestimate Heimdall, and he could be used quite effectively in modern meta. He can, however, get exhausted, and that slows him down a little bit. Finally, our last honorable mention is this dude right here, AntiVenom. AntiVenom, when he dropped into the opposite team from you in PvP with Pestilence Beast, my god, it was scary as hell. Reason being is I Am the Cure. I Am the Cure was a vicious move in his kit. It was one of the few depower abilities at the time, along with Fandral and our little chickadee Spiral. The thing is, I Am the Cure hit everybody, and back in the day, it wasn't a 60% chance. It was you were depowered. Not only that, you were webbed, and you were opportunistically debuffed, which could have been obnoxious. With Pesty on the field, there almost wasn't any stopping AntiVenom. Unfortunately, his AI got a little stupid after I Am the Cure, but if you got hit with I Am the Cure and then the next round he crusaded you, you were pretty much fucked. Cleansing Touch was the original Purge. At the time, I do believe, I forget what the name of it was, but I know it wasn't Purged. It was like Cleansed or something like that. It's an interesting thing, because they've changed it. It now strictly says the Purge effect, but we still have the Sterilize effect, which is kind of neat. It's a little bit different. Sterilize removes both harmful and beneficial effects from the target. Now, in the presence of Pesty, it's probably not going to remove the harmful effects, but I would really have to try that out and figure it out. But there are certain wombo combos that are available with AntiVenom. If you hit somebody with something like Doom or Genetically Altered from the Pound of Cure, you can then Cleansing Touch the person and you will immediately proc their heavy hits. So for example, Doom really hits you if you remove it by any other means other than resting. Well, Cleansing Touch was the original way of doing that before Demise ever came out. We didn't have Demise when AntiVenom was around, but we did have Doom. So you could put Doom on somebody and then sterilize them, and then of course Doom chunks them. Same thing for Genetically Altered from Pound of Cure. Unfortunately, AntiVenom has just completely disappeared thanks to the nerf to depower. He still could potentially get used by bleed teams, and in all honesty, if I saw AntiVenom and a Scroll of Rudamaroth or Pesty on the other side, I still might flinch. He is able to gain the effects of the symbiote ISOs, like this one, Symbiotic Energy. All allies with a symbiote gain an increase to accuracy, attack, defense, and evasion. Now, that does apply to himself, so it is basically a symbiote morale boost. AntiVenom may be a bit crazy, but he deserves a spot in the honorable mention because he was quite obnoxious with the right team-ups at the time. Unfortunately, he had taken too big of a hit by the time Hybrid came along. Scroll of Runemeroth, Hybrid, and AntiVenom would have been something that would have been fairly scary to see. So guys, there is the top most impactful Bruisers of all time in PvP. For the countdown, they are Null and Kurth as the worthy, Juggernaut, Groot, and Heroic Age Iron Fist. We have an honorable mention going out to Ares, Hindle, Molly Hayes, Thor, World War II Captain America, and AntiVenom. Actually, honestly, most Bruisers do fairly well. You could even give a nod over to Iceman and Hercules and X-23 and even the Warbringer version of Hulk. Warbringer version of Hulk was quite popular back in the day, but most of the ones that I've talked about have just had a little bit more longevity than those. Probably one of the only other ones deserving of a honorable mention would be Warbringer Hulk. But, you know, the Scrapper version was fairly popular too at the time. So there you go, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video and the background soundtrack. Take care. See you during the week in Marvel Avengers Alliance.